Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the GBSN Cross-Border Coffee Break webinar series. Today, our webinar is on the Network Readiness Index 2019 towards a future-ready society, presented by the Portulans Institute. So very quickly, as participants, you will be muted during the entire duration of the webinar. However, during the presentation, you could submit a question at any time, and the participants, the speakers will not be interrupted. We will do a Q&A portion at the end of the webinar, in which we will read the questions out that you submitted to the presenters, and they will answer them live. All registrants will receive a webinar recording, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a written Q&A report. To submit a question, please click the Q&A button on your black toolbar. You'll see it here. This box will pop up. Please input your question here. If you'd like to send it anonymously, click the little checkbox here and then click send. All questions will be put into a queue and we'll get to them during the Q&A portion. Right, so my name is Nicole Zephyrin. I'm the Assistant Director of Communications and Membership at the Global Business School Network. So if you've participated in previous cross-border coffee break webinars, you've definitely heard me. I'm the one that usually facilitates the webinars. So today we have three presenters with us. First, Soumitra Dutta, who is GBSN's board chairman. He is also Professor of Management and former founding dean of Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. Soumitra is also the founding editor of the Global Innovation Index. He is also the founding co-editor of the Network Readiness Index, published by the Portulans Institute. We also have Bruno Lanvin. He is the executive director for global indices at INSEAD. Bruno is also the founder and CEO of DL Partners SA and president of the Smart City Observatory. Bruno Lanvin is the founding co-editor of the Network Readiness Index. And last but not least, Carolina Rossini. Carolina Rossini is the founder of the Network Readiness Index. She's also the secretary for the board and CEO of the Portulans Institute. Welcome to all three of our presenters. So now I'll hand it over to Carolina to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Nicole. I hope you all can hear me, and thank you for joining us this morning. I had the pleasure to co-found Portulans Institute with Bruno and Soumitra last year, and we have, I think, very interesting mission to this community that is in attendance today. We were founded, as I said, late last year to really be the house of various data-driven efforts to measure and assess countries' competitiveness, innovation, and technology. So we are an independent nonprofit, non-partisan research and educational institute based here in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to develop a cross-community of knowledge and dialogue on how people, technology, and innovation contribute to sustainability and inclusive growth, to inform policymakers by producing independent, rigorous metric and data-based research, and to collaborate with the private sector leaders in driving business agenda that invest in people, technology, and innovation, really supporting firms to innovate and be competitive. And finally, to host and organize various events here in DC, but in various other places. The Network Readiness Index, for example, that you're gonna learn more about today, we launched in Geneva last year. And finally, we have a series of programs that I would love to invite you all to get engaged. As I mentioned, our focus areas are technology competitiveness, innovation readiness, people and global talent. And we produce indexes that relate to all of this. And both Soumitra and Bruno have been working for over 2 decades on these indexes. Our programs for now are 4. We have the academic network, where we bring professors and research institutes and universities together to work on these topics. The community of practice, where we bring together peers from the business sector to really tackle some topics and elements that are core for innovation. One, for example, that we are working on is artificial intelligence, privacy, and ethics. Finally, we have our corporate partners program that help us also produce a lot of research and, in some cases, country studies. And finally, the fellows program, which we launched early this month. We received a very good amount of applications from around the world, and we are announcing our fellows for this year now on Monday. It's going to be an incredibly diverse community focusing very concrete projects. So please join me and join Portulans activities. We have a newsletter you can sign up to. Thank you, Nicole.
And now Soumitra. Soumitra, I think you're on mute.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I thank you for joining us for this webinar. GBSN is a very global community, and the topic today is one which I think is of high relevance to all of us in a number of ways. Digital is impacting our lives individually, and of course our schools and that curriculum and other kind of services we provide to our students. Digital is in fact high on the agenda of education as a sector. And I hope that today's webinar provides you with some insights and some further, let's say, questions on how digital can be applied more effectively inside our own context. I will begin the presentation with some comments about the Network Readiness Index, and then I will hand over to my co-author, Bruno Lanvin, and Bruno will talk a little bit more about the results of the index this year. So before I talk about the index, I wanted to just give you a context of how at least Bruno and I have seen and witnessed the evolution of our thinking around technology. And like many of you, we have been observing very carefully how technology impacts us in multiple ways over the last couple of decades. And I would say that, let's say at the start of this new millennium, around 2000, 2001, there was a lot of positive energy around technology. And I remember very clearly when we went to meetings, all the talk was around how technology would usher in this wonderful future for everyone, how people would have mobile phones or access to technology would be much more democratized, and essentially the world would become a better place. Now, the last 20 years, I think it's correct to say that we have seen a lot of positive progress. Our lives have changed in multiple ways in which we could not have imagined before. Today, if you think of the daily lives we lead, whether it's checking the weather, booking a plane, or whether it's driving to our office or to a destination, technology is a very core component of our lives. Even inside our own work organizations and business schools, technology is a very important part of what we do and how we do things. Now, yet at the same time, if we fast forward to today's time and year, and just reflect on how the discussion and the tone around technology has changed compared to 2 decades ago, I think most of us would agree that while the positive aspect is certainly present, a lot of negative or undertone of concern has overtaken a lot of the positive aspects. By which I mean is, starting with whatever happened with some of the global, let's say, elements like the Cambridge Analytica, scandal, or other kinds of revelations that some of the big tech giants are, capturing so much information about us, The book published recently by Shoshana Zuboff on surveillance capitalism, about how the new model of capitalism is based on really exploiting people's information and daily habits without necessarily the agreement, concerns around privacy, security, and I can go on. And I think these kinds of issues have forced a different side of technology to come to the surface. And I think, as we live, at least those of us who are in the US, this year is election year in the US, and there's a huge amount of concern about the kind of information people are receiving today online. I've seen some forecasts in which people have said that by 2022, in less than 2 years from now, an average person will receive more fake news than real news. So the question is, how does political discourse, how does governments, how do corporations actually work in an environment where technology is perhaps distorting the landscape, is becoming very important. And fundamentally, what it is doing is that it is reducing trust across the board, trust in government, trust in corporations, trust across society. And so we are seeing some kind of a negative aspects of technology being emphasized, or at least being raised. So in some sense, the pendulum has swung from a lot of hope 20 years ago to what I would say is a lot of concern today. Clearly, we have to find a middle ground. The positive things stay, and the negative things also have to be managed, and the risks have to be controlled. And the Network Readiness Index really is an attempt to try and help us do so in some kind of a balanced and a globally coordinated fashion. So coming to the Network Readiness Index model itself, the origins go back to 2000, when the World Economic Forum convened a small group, and Bruno and I were part of the group, to try to understand, can we in fact come up with a model and a framework for understanding how technology impacts competitiveness of nations and development of societies. Those days, there were a lot of anecdotes and a lot of stories about what was happening in different parts of the world, but there were few actual data points and few frameworks to use. So we came up with the NRI at the World Economic Forum, and the first NRI was published in the 2001-2002 time period. And really, I think, looking back, it was quite future oriented, because in many ways in 2001-2002 we brought in aspects including, for example, the governmental regulation aspects, the societal aspects, the other kinds of aspects of technology usage, which were not really of high concern in the early part of this new century. It was really around those days, people thought around bits and bytes and around communication speeds and number of PCs, and people didn't think about the social and other sort of political aspects of technology. Today, of course, we know those are very important. And over the last, I would say, 2 decades, the NRI evolved, in multiple ways, and the framework, kept evolving. The framework served many governments to help frame the technology policy, and actually we're very happy that many countries in the world use the Network Readiness Index framework to guide the technology policies. More recently, in 2018, 2019, Bruno and I, along with Carolina, formed the Portulans Institute, which is a not-for-profit based in DC, as Carolina mentioned earlier. And we have redesigned the NRI now to make it what we believe is ready for the future, more future ready, and to help us make the right decisions around societies and governments and corporations use of technology in the future. A lot of the aspects of the new Network Readiness framework really reflect some of the concerns I mentioned earlier. So if you look at the, I'm trying to move the slide. Nicole is not moving to the next one. Okay, now it's moving, yeah. Thank you. So if you look at the model that we have used, and that's the structure on the right-hand side of the slide, that captures a lot of the desire from my side to reflect the new future for technology. So here, if at a very high level, what we are saying with this framework is that our future depends on being able to combine technology, and people in the right governance framework such that we create the right kind of impact we seek. So it's a very simple statement. And in fact, if you dive deeper into what actually it means in the various sub-elements that you see out there, there are a number of interesting elements which we have chosen to emphasize now in this new redesigned NRI as compared to previous editions of an NRI. So on the technology, for example, we have chosen to highlight the focus on future technologies. We do see technology progressing at a very rapid pace, and certainly some new disruptions like AI, causing significant change in the future. So we think it's important to emphasize that. Under the people dimension, we have retained the old NRI focus of the three major actors: individuals, business, and governments. On the governance side, which is really a whole new pillar in NRI, we have brought in those elements of trust, inclusion, much more positively and much more with a strong emphasis. Regulation was there to some degree in the previous, but we are now sort of reorganized in this inside the pillar of governance. And on the impact side, we have really focused not just on the economic impacts, but also on the quality of life and the impact on the SDG goals that we are trying to seek as a collective society. Now, this model with 4 pillars, of course, has the 12 subcomponents, and we have 62 indicators that help to measure the NRI. And if I can have the next slide, Nicole. And basically what we do is we use that data set to look at the progress or achievements of 121 economies in the world. We, of course, try and cover as many as possible. But due to data limitations, we are often limited in terms of the number of countries we can cover. And in this latest edition, we cover 121 economies. And there on the right-hand side, you see the top 10 economies listed. Now, one thing which is very obvious when you look at this top 10 economies is that they are all high-income economies. And it's an interesting reality, but we see a very high correlation between the top performing economies and high income countries. There is obviously a lot of, let's say, reasons why we see this correlation. The high income economies typically have the most well-developed institutions, have the most well-developed educational systems, and have traditionally also invested the most in technology. And that at the same time does create a follow-on positive impact in the performance on the NRI and also in terms of creating wealth for their own citizens and staying in that zone of high-income economies. We do see other countries, as Bruno will talk later, in the middle and low-income countries also making progress. But the presence and the strong presence of these high-income economies, in fact, points to one of the concerns that we identify in the NRI results over the years, is that we see the digital divide not just continuing, but also, in fact, growing. And in fact, technology is some kind of an accelerator. And at a very simple level, we see the richer countries being able to have better technology, be able to deploy and use better resources with better educated people and create more value than poorer countries which have technology but maybe not as good, have great potential for human talent but not as well educated, and have some resources but not as much resources, and they create value but not as much value as the richer countries. So we see a fair degree of diversion out there happening, and this points to one very important policy challenge, is that if we do not do something to help accelerate and turbocharge the rate of ICT development, adoption, usage in the poorer countries in the world or in the middle and low income economies, we will see this gap in fact growing, and this might in the end cause greater inequality in the world and cause more distrust in the world and society as a whole. So that's a concern that we see in the NRI. Maybe at this point I hand over to Bruno for walking us through the results of the NRI.
Thank you, Soumitra. Hello everybody. The main reason why I'm speaking today is, of course, that one cannot imagine a Valentine encounter without some kind of French accent at some point in time. So that's what I will do now. Getting back to what Soumitra described right now as the global picture on how the Network Readiness Index tells us what is happening and what has been happening over the last 20 years and could be happening in the foreseeable future. This diagram gives the overall representation of where countries stand. The horizontal axis represents the degree of wealth, that is the rich countries on the right, the poor countries on the left, and the vertical axis is the NRI score. So those who score high are at the top of the diagram, and those who score low are at the bottom of the diagram. And what we can see from this diagram is two things. First, the countries are very much ordered around that black regression line, which shows a strong correlation between wealth and network readiness, as Soumitra just mentioned. The other thing we can take from this diagram is, given the fact that the bubbles are in size proportional to the size of the population, we see big bubbles like the red one, which is China, and the green one, which is India, moving up fairly quickly up the ladder. So the dynamic of this diagram is something worth considering as well. It remains that indeed inequalities tend to be on the rise, which is a concern, and AI will not diminish that. But there are also reasons to hope, and that's what the next slide shows. If we look at the top performance in each of the income groups, we see that indeed there are champions everywhere. And there are lots of positive lessons we can draw from the experience of these leaders. So I will leave aside the high-income countries, which are the only inhabitants of the top quartile of the index. Soumitra mentioned that. It is something we see in the top 10, in the top 20, and it will not change easy. But if we add to that the fact that performances on the index more or less follow what the income per capita would predict, that was the previous diagram, we see some countries above the black line. If we take, for instance, upper middle income countries, Malaysia, 32nd in the world, and China, 41st in the world, illustrate the fact that possibilities exist for emerging countries to actually move up the ladder of network readiness rather fast. If we take lower middle income countries, Vietnam is a particularly remarkable example of a country that has been moving up steadily, and not just in technology, also in talent and innovation. We see Vietnam becoming a star in Southeast Asia. Among the low-income countries, the experience of Rwanda in sub-Saharan Africa is indeed a remarkable one, which shows that with enough political will and strategic vision, even a small, landlocked, poor country like Rwanda can indeed achieve a lot by using technology in a way that favors human development and societal development as a whole. The next slide shows that this performance is distributed in different ways. We have confirmation that in terms of continents, Europe continues to lead. Of course, this has to be discounted by the fact that Americas is aggregated. So Americas include North America and South and Latin America. And clearly there's a big difference between the two. The African continent continues to lag in spite of bright examples like Mauritius or Rwanda, which I just mentioned. And the degree of dispersion in performance is particularly high in Asia Pacific. This is a very interesting result because in many ways, the Asia Pacific region has been the one where discrepancies were highest. We have the advanced players. This is a region that includes OECD countries like Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore among the champions, but it also includes Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, who are among the poor countries. So it's important to consider that from a geographical point of view, we have basically a confirmation of what we saw at the global level, but also significant differences if we go to a lower level of granularity. If, and that is the next slide, we move to the level of identifying why some of the countries, in particular regions, perform better than others. Again, we have to acknowledge the disparity in the numbers. We only have one African country among the 122 covered who is in the top, the first half. That's Mauritius. Even Rwanda, who is performing spectacularly well in some areas of the index, still ranks 89 out of the 122. So the digital divide is still very much there. The divergence between North and South America, I mentioned, it is more of a concern if one considers the fact that the US and Canada are actually accelerating, they're actually improving the performance in the index, where most of South America actually either plateaus or sees a decrease in their performance on the NRI. And as I mentioned before, if we look at elements like trust, AI, talent devoted to ICT sectors and activities, we have reasons to worry about a possible increase in the digital divide between the rich and poor countries. So if we move to the next slide now, if we take all that together and bring it at the level of the pillars, the 4 pillars in the model: technology, people, governance, impact, and Soumitra describes the philosophy with upon which these pillars have been built. We see basically that this overall picture is replicated across all pillars. So the fact that we have a digital divide, that the more advanced countries score better, that we have disparities between 2 parts of the American side of the world, all that is true not only at the global level of the index, but also in each and every one of the pillars we identified. That was a bit of a surprise to us, because we felt that when we introduced governance, which is radically different from what we had before in NRI, and to some extent when we modernized the impact pillar, the picture would be different. It is not. So it's both a reason to be happy about the stability of the model in spite of its upgrading, but also a reason to worry continuously about how to reduce inequalities by developing technology with a more human touch. Governance among these 4 pillars is probably the ones in which we have the lower degree of inequality between regions of the world, which is a reason to think positively about what could happen. It shows that in the area of regulation, basic rights, respect for the law, contractual in particular, business environment, things have been moving towards a higher degree of convergence between rich and poor countries. So a number of positive lessons emerging. And what the next slide tells us is that indeed, if we look at each of those pillars, we can learn from the champions. Clearly, the US remains at top of the rankings in terms of technology, whichever way we define it. In terms of the inclusion of the human factor, there's a lot of lessons to be drawn from the experience of Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden, as is the case for governance, where Norway appears at the top. And in terms of impact, smaller economies like Singapore, Switzerland, Sweden also give us an indication of how performance can be improved. So we have all reasons to think that in the coming years, the continuous publication of NRI will allow us to learn even more from the experience of the champions, whichever regions they may come from. And last but not least, in terms of future readiness, that's the next slide, we are devoting particular importance to the SDGs. And the SDGs incarnates right now a global effort endorsed by public entities and private entities to pursue a number of objectives in 17 areas. It's a very far-reaching kind of effort. And none of them is specifically linked to ICT or to network readiness, which is good because it confirms our view that network readiness and ICT are a horizontal dimension of global development. Yet NRI has to dig a little more into these SDGs, because if we believe, as we all do in Portulans Institute, that ICT can help mankind to face some of the most urgent challenges it faces now, in terms of sustainable environment, in terms of inequalities, in terms of job creation, etc., it is important to demonstrate it and to measure it. So network readiness has a direct potential, which is fairly obvious for everybody in SDGs like health, like education, like job creation, like innovation, and like city management. But all of them could be influenced by our ability to combine what Soumitra described as the right combination between people and technology under the right type of governance. So that's where we are now. This is what we are aiming at doing. And it can be summarized in a few key messages. So let's move to the next slide. And basically, there's not 200 key messages. We boil them down to 6. And we have to recognize, number one, the stability of the index. Again, this is both good news, because you can use time series, you can look at the way countries have been moving through the index, but it is also a continuous concern in terms of growing inequalities. A second key message is that indeed, and that's the punchline about the NRI, integrating people and technology with the right governance structure is key to our collective prosperous future. Third key message, the technological divide remains an important concern. And by technological divide, we should include things which are not directly technological. That is content, the use of different vehicles to promote development in different kind of contexts. All that concurs to showing that the divide may increase. Number 4, technology and impact of ICT drive regional differences. So what we see within the Asia-Pacific region, for instance, what we see happening between North America and South America is indeed about technology and impact. So it's worth looking at it both from an econometric angle, a benchmarking angle, but also from a strategic and policy-driven angle. The message number 5 is about urgency. We need to quantify the future readiness of countries. If we don't, we may misguide efforts. We may choose objectives that may be hampered by the fact that we have ignored some key dimensions of the development process in different parts of the world. And last but not least of these 6 messages, the SDGs, which is the best we have right now to pursue global efforts to face some of the major challenges that are ahead for us, for our generation and for the next ones, is technological innovation. So we need to restore the faith in innovation, to restore the faith in technology, and we cannot do that out of a manifesto. We have to do that out of facts and quantified evidence that good things are happening and could happen in the future. So that's a brief summary of what we've been trying to do by relaunching NRI this year. Just a little bit of information on the last slide. For those of you interested in continuing this dialogue, these are the addresses of the websites for the index, for the Institute, and also for any dialogue you wish to pursue. There's also a Twitter handle, and we're active on social networks. So you will find a lot of additional information by visiting these various sites. I now hand it over back to Nicole to get to the most interesting part of this coffee session, which will be the Q&A.
Thank you, Bruno. Before we start the Q&A, Soumitra, Carolina, any last thoughts before we open it up to questions?
Maybe some thoughts from my side is that the NRI is perhaps unique in the sense that it has data for now almost the good part of 2 decades. There is almost no other data series that long and that rich in terms of the different elements that it considers around technology. The only other equivalent probably would be the ITU's Development Index, which is much more focused on technical aspects like broadband penetration and the technology infrastructure aspects. NRI is much more holistic, looks at a variety of aspects of government and social and other kinds of elements. And I would encourage students to use this. A lot of the data and the reports are all available for free. And there might be students in the PhD program in various institutions might be interested in using this further. And certainly we are open to sharing information much more widely about the NRI and its results over the last several years.
Thank you, Soumitra. Okay, so now we will begin to take questions, and we've got a few submitted so far. Okay, from Tariq Salim from American University in Cairo. NRI is closely related to the fourth industrial revolution. How do you see your index on the global level to be used in research on the fourth industrial revolution?
So let me just take the response to that, and maybe Bruno might add his perspective. Tariq, so great to, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your question also. Great to connect via this webinar. I think you're absolutely right. Digital and NRI are core elements of the fourth industrial revolution that is happening around us. And if you look at the fourth industrial revolution, there is no good other model or framework that I know of that really tries to assess the broader holistic impact of the fourth industrial revolution. So in my view, the NRI really tries to get us a step closer to having a framework, having some data-based, evidence-based support for policies and decisions that we might make in the public and private sector. And certainly what I do hope is that, with the support of various key global organizations and key academic institutions, we are able to enhance the work on NRI further in key areas to understand in more depth how the fourth industrial revolution is impacting specific societies. So, for example, in Egypt or in Northern Africa, the framework could be expanded to a much more detailed analysis of the region or the country. And the basic idea that how technology and people have to work together really is central to the fourth industrial revolution in my own belief.
Yes, if I may add to what Soumitra just said, I totally agree with the statement that indeed what NRI is trying to do, that is look at future readiness, needs to be linked to the efforts made in particular by the World Economic Forum to chart what the fourth industrial revolution could be about. One of the major merits of Industry 4.0 approach is to move away from the traditional habit to look at industry in terms of sectors and try to identify what are the horizontal dimensions that are indeed going to influence all sectors of our economies, whether we're talking about platform economies, whether we're talking about the way in which we want to finance innovation. There are horizontal dimension, which will not only affect all sectors, but will destroy the barriers that we currently see between sectors. So this is very convergent in terms of way of thinking. And as Soumitra, I see excellent prospects that by digging further in what's happening at the level of countries, doing deep dives, we're going to uncover some truth about how these dimensions can be combined in the future.
Thank you, Bruno. Next question from an anonymous. How much are you able to account for political will or lack thereof versus resource as a reason for lack of progress / readiness?
Bruno, do you want to take a shot?
Yeah. Yes. I like the implied double negative in that question. Let me put it in a positive way. We see that in many countries, the political will, when it is incarnated at the highest level of governments and industry, makes a difference. A brilliant example is that of Rwanda. Rwanda is a country that had to move away from the impact of genocide and try to identify what could be the sources of energy to rebuild its future. And the choice made by by President Kagame and his team was indeed, let's look at innovation and technology. Let's see how we can be the little guy who became a champion in Africa. And that made a big difference. We see that happening in a number of other parts of the world. Singapore is, of course, a major example, whereby when in 50 years ago, Singapore became independent from Malaysia, they had no place to go. And they rebuilt their economy actually around the notion of better using technology and moving it at the service of diversification and innovation. So political will makes a difference. The absence of political will is not necessarily a negative will to say we don't like technology. The negative is to leave it to decision makers who are more bureaucrats or linked to a particular part of the economy, and that typically doesn't have the same positive effect on society. So I would tend to focus on the positive aspects, the good examples we have, but we cannot ignore that the biggest force that needs to be opposed is often inertia.
Let me add to that. Sorry, Carolina, go on.
No, I just wanted to add one element, right? Looking at the metrics we use for the NRI, especially the input metrics, for example, on the regulation side, right? We do count has positive if a country, for example, has a privacy law, right? So those things do mirror some, a lot of the input metrics mirror fundamental rights, if you will, that are considered positives for the growth of a country. So I just want to mention this specifically regarding our metrics and methodology.
Yeah, and just to add from my side, I think the government plays a very key role in helping drive the technology strategy for a country. And I take the examples of the two most important countries now in the space, China and the US. China, of course, we know the government plays a very key role in helping shape how the sector is evolving, whatever we might criticize, positive and negatives. In the US too, the government is playing a very key role in helping shape the sector also, like in the recent budget proposals, President Trump has doubled the investments in AI and quantum computing and is giving a very determined government push towards new technology. So I think the government role in helping shape digital policy is extremely critical.
Great, thank you. Next comment from Daniel Zaretsky in Uzbekistan. He says, sorry I am joining this late. I work with the ZO Fund in Uzbekistan, which is a new NGO supported by the president and is aiming to develop the startup ecosystem and bring technology and investment to the country. I noticed that Uzbekistan is not on the NRI. If you have not covered this yet, could you let us know how we can cooperate and possibly get Uzbekistan on the NRI? This question is probably relevant to others whose countries are also not on the list.
I feel, Soumitra, do you want to answer that? Otherwise, I'm happy to comment.
So let me answer that. So, as I said at the start, our goal is to try to cover as many countries as possible. So breadth is an important goal for us. Yet, because of data limitations, we often are unable to cover all countries. So typically, the informal heuristic we use is that for a certain variable to be included, it should have data for at least 70% of the countries. And for a certain country to be included, there should be data for at least 70% of the variables for that country. So when some countries do not meet the criteria, they unfortunately are not included in the ranking. When some variables do not meet the criteria, they're not included also. There are lots of great variables that are only available for OECD countries, for example. So I think these are challenges of any data collection exercise that we undertake. Yet at the same time, for the countries for which we are missing data, we often work with them to help them towards providing data to the right international sources, because most of our data comes from global, international, multilateral organizations, and often there are internal challenges that the countries face in providing data at the right time and the right kind of frequency. And if you're able to work with the countries and make that happen, we have seen actually many countries that were not included before join the ranks of the ranking of the ranked countries. And I think that's what I hope will happen in the case of Uzbekistan too. We're happy to work with you or others in the country to see how we can address some of the data problems that are currently preventing the country from being included.
Yeah, if I may just add a footnote to that, very often we have countries that are not included in the rankings because data is missing. But data is not always missing everywhere. Whereas there may be 3 well-documented pillars in the model for which we have the data, and 1 for which there is no data or insufficient data. So this means that for some of the countries not included, there are also very interesting stories to tell. Because we're mentioning Uzbekistan, I should mention that indeed we have decided to have a special study, a case study on Uzbekistan as one of the examples of countries for which we have missing data, but where we think there's an interesting story to tell. So expect to see a few things on our website about Uzbekistan soon.
Yeah. And if I may just add one thing, one of the goals of NRI, as Soumitra mentioned in the beginning, is really to serve as an assessment tool for action later, right? So if we understand that, if we actually map additionally the countries where the data is missing, the message we are giving to the country is, look, we need more data collection so you can be better assist to make data-based decisions for your policies and interventions, right? So it's also a tool to pressure countries to create better internal assessment to guide their policymaking.
I think we have time for one last question. Okay, from an anonymous, what are some of the most prohibitive regulations you've found standing in the way of what could be easy wins?
I may take a shot at this one, Soumitra, unless you want to start. Hello?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so we have a number of variables that look at various components of what makes a good environment for technology development and the use of ICTs generally. Clearly, there's a number of elements that have proved successful. For instance, to have competitive environments for the development of, let's say, mobile telephony or other aspects has proved to work very well. Countries that have kept either telecom monopolies, there are very few now, or insufficient competition, are actually hampering their own efforts to move up the ladder of NRI. But among some of the most prohibitive regulations sometimes have to do with more than just technology. We've seen a rise over the last few years of multilateral disciplines, the rise of nationalistic and protectionist policies, which indeed are hampering global development in terms of innovation and technology. So if we try to identify the most prohibitive regulations, we would need to look beyond just technology. It is important to realize that the countries that have been able to move up the ladder fastest, smaller economies in particular, but also China, have done it basically because they've been integrating more and more into international trade. So for emerging countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, this becomes a big threat above their head. If indeed international trade generally, but also investment, circulation of people and ideas become more restricted, their own efforts to move up the ladder of NRI may be diminished.
Let me just add one perspective, from my own experience. So we have worked with a number of governments and number of organizations, both the public and private sector, over the years, and especially at the government level, where you set the regulations, both at the national and at the local levels. One of the issues that we see is the challenge of coordination across different ministries or different functional departments and groups. As Bruno said earlier about the SDGs, ICT or technology is a horizontal platform that impacts all different sectors. And if you want to actually have positive change or impact, you need to bring these others, parallel sister ministries or organizations on board. So for example, if you want to, use technology to improve education, you need to have the education ministry, completely buying into the process and helping drive the change. So I think the technology ministries themselves can only do limited change. Of course, they can change the landscape by, the broadband competition situation, or the number of telecom players they allow, or setting some kind of upper and lower bounds on the charges possible. So they have important roles. But a lot of the actual impact relies on coordination and cooperation with ministries or other functions. So that's an area where I think there's some easy wins. At the same time, requires it to determine push to drive that coordination, collaboration across the government or the organization.
And if I may add just one thing, Nicole, Bruno and Soumitra are also behind a couple of other indexes like the Global Competitiveness Talent Index, the Global Innovation Index. And why I'm bringing that is they also help us understand exactly what they were talking now, that the restrictions go beyond technology, right? And looking at those indexes together, you have a great picture for a certain country on how they are tackling all the key elements for competitiveness. And also, Nicole, if I may, before we end, I want to thank WITSA for the support in the production of the NRI this past year.
Very good. Okay, so it looks like we're close to time. Thank you, Soumitra, Bruno, Carolina, for this webinar presentation. For those of you who have joined late, not to worry, it has been recorded, and all the material, including the recording, the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a documented Q&A report, will be sent to all registrants of this webinar. It'll also be posted online to the GBSN webinar library, and it'll live there to be accessible at any time. This is a reminder that the Portulans Institute is on Twitter, so please make sure you follow them. Their Twitter handle is @PortulansI. You can also sign up for news and updates through their newsletter on their website. I will include a link to both in the follow-up email with all the material. If you'd like to connect directly with the speakers, please reach out to them on LinkedIn, or you can contact the General Portulans Institute email. Thank you again, Soumitra, Carolina, and Bruno, for a very informative presentation. And like I said, if you have extra questions, please feel free to follow up with the presenters directly.
Thank you, Nicole. Now it's time for all of us to take care of our Valentine readiness.
Yes, happy Valentine's Day to everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.